you. So I'm going to mention by name some famous scientists, philosophers, historians, and poets, and won't go into detail what they accomplished or when they lived and died. So you're just going to have to trust me on those that you don't remember through your history. Now, in 1933, the Humanism Manifesto was published as a philosophy and a value system that does not include belief in any personal deity or higher power, in which the co-author, Roy Wood Sellers, states, "Humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values," end of quote. In doubting modern man, if he concedes that he does possess some point of view, he will most likely put his complete trust in the accomplished knowledge provided by science only. Science has admittedly had impressive results in several areas of experience, yet science is far from being infallible. Surprisingly, most of those who put their faith in science would agree. Nevertheless, when it comes to the question of personal faith in conflict with science, they do not hesitate to proclaim science as being absolute. The spirit of the modern world is embodied in the Humanistic Manifesto's claim that if religious faith and science clash on any given position, it is faith that must be abandoned in order to attain science. It should be stressed that the dominant philosophies of the 21st century dismiss Christianity either as false or meaningless, and they do this because of Christianity's supposedly unscientific character. Now, before accepting blindly the judgment that science has disproven Christianity, it would be wise to raise some important questions. And we begin by asking, how much of the world can science know? So the first of these should be the question of whether or not science has equal success in all areas of inquiry. If not, then to claim that science has disproven Christianity does not necessarily mean anything. After all, it would be ridiculous to argue because a certain singer shows some talent in rap music that he could be successful in opera. Yet the claim is often made that because science has been successful in technology, it must equally be successful in theories about man and the ancient past. The important question to ask is whether or not the success of science in technology gives it equal authority in the realm of theory. Now, theory for us means an assumption or guess based on limited knowledge or information. To answer the question, let us compare two scientific activities. Number one, the development of the airplane, and number two, the search of man's subhuman ancestors. In the first venture, progress has come, but numerous mistakes went before the success and continue to proceed improvements. But how does the scientist recognize his mistakes? Well, in most cases, he finds out quickly when he tries to get the plane off the ground. Now consider the search for man's prehistoric ancestors. Mistakes are much more likely because there is far less material to work with. Yet nothing is going to fall out of the sky to warn the investigator. It could and has taken a generation to correct errors about some hypothesis concerning past life. Even deliberate hoax have gone undetected for decades. Consider the Plitmen, or sometimes referred to as the missing link. It took 41 years. It was in 1953 to learn that a gigantic fraud had been perpetrated in the name of science. Now, this is not to say that science is naive, but rather to emphasize that science does not have the same degree of accuracy in all fields of study. They don't always get it right the first, the second, or even the third attempt. Before we accept uncritically the scientific reconstruction of man's history, let us remember that much of what is taught in theory lacks the correctness that technology receives when it puts its theories into practice. A second question: how certain is science in its reconstruction of the past? A particularly interesting part of the scientific reconstruction of human history concerns the alleged cavemen of prehistoric times. Now, there is a popular mental picture of our ancestors as subhuman cavemen which ate raw meat, dragging their wife around by the hair and yielding to the most savage animal instincts within. Such an existence seems necessary in the mind of science to prepare a transition from ape man to human. You see, it fits their concept. Now, when we ask how much is really known about the caveman, it becomes clear that about all we know is that they drew pictures of animals. A.H. Compton, in his 1940 book, The Human Meaning of Science, points out the famous wall paintings of the animals in the caves of the Old Stone Age show an appreciation and skill in depicting action and perception that is superior to that of the average untrained modern, end of quote. Compton adds that the same ancient ancestors who found art had an early understanding of music. In fact, advanced in instrumental techniques. Now that sounds somewhat like Jubal's generation in Genesis chapter 4, verse 21. Any writer of cavemen novels will find that his readers are disappointed if their cavemen heroes went off drawing pictures and sang songs. So they are fashioned as primitive, peanut brain ape men. The simple fact is early man drew pictures on caves, but the popular belief of cavemen as wild, animal-like creatures had to be invented so the evolutionary theory could find an intermediate being just beyond the beast level. From beating his wife against the wall to painting her on the wall as he whistles a tune. If evolutionary account were correct, we would expect something like the myth of the caveman to be right. However, we must repeatedly ask of such reconstruction of history, how much is fact and how much is simply the implications of an unproven theory? Now, another question to ask is, what does it mean to say that science has disproven religion? It clearly does not mean that it has disproven it for all scientists. There have and are a number of scientists who believe in God and the literal truth of the Bible, contrary to the current teachings of certain university professors. Now, here is a short list of renowned scientists born before 1900 that believed in God. Now, their discoveries in science more and more confirm the existence of a creator. You had Nicholas Copernicus, Francis Bacon, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, who made the statement, the Bible cannot err. You had Rene Descartes, you had Pascal, you had Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, William Thomas Calvin, Max Planck, and the one that we know probably the best, Albert Einstein, who made this statement, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. Furthermore, the claim that science has disproven religion cannot mean that it has disproven the existence of God, nor does it imply that science has found a better way to live. At most, the claim means that science has made it possible to conceive of an alternative to Christianity, an option. However, this requires far greater faith in the unproven than it does in simple New Testament Christianity. Now, finally, on this point, we must ask whether scientific method can learn the truth about all areas of life, or if it's just methods are limited to the external objects. Question is science able to describe man's most certain inner knowledge? If science cannot accurately describe all areas of experience, it may well be the case that the evidence for religious faith is there to be found in such areas. The question which arises is this: what is our greatest certainty? When science studies external objects, its findings seem almost certain. When we follow science from the world of matter as it studies higher and higher forms, however, certain limitations become obvious. First of all, it becomes clear that some objects of study are not simple objects. While the scientist is observing those, the object may be looking back. The more complex an object becomes, the more aware the scientist should become that there is an inner side which he cannot observe directly. In the case of man, the object of study may be studying the observer. The scientist can observe and classify behavior, but thought processes are likely going on that will never be observable in an outward behavior. What is certain so far is that scientific observation, because it is only observation, is inadequate in explaining man. Therefore, it has only a limited function in explaining our world. It does not have all the answers. What's also certain is that man has an inner source of knowledge, sometimes referred or called the practical reason, in which he is aware of experiences such as freedom of choice, the duty to do things that he does not like, the sense of reverence before unseen powers, and the feeling that he is not alone in the universe, that there is something beyond this physical realm. How do you explain everyone has a conscience at birth? Although these experiences may be ridiculed by some as non-scientific, it is important to discover what kind of knowledge might be more reliable. Science has relied most confidently in the past on the law for every effect there is a cause. Nevertheless, when I ask myself the question, which do I know better, the law of cause-effect or my own feelings? I can readily answer that I know my own feelings better. Now, this is what I mean. If I can be deceived about my own thoughts, how much more can I be deceived about the laws of science? Belief in such laws requires, number one, accuracy of the laws, and number two, accuracy of the methods of knowing them. The wide claim of science made over the whole range of human activities runs into firm resistance when it turns to man, for it is unable to get inside of man, to know him at his deepest level. As a result, his moral experience calls for an explanation, deeper than what can be learned by studying him as an object in science. Now, it is a common tendency among naive people to believe that modern man is superior to his ancestors, in that he no longer needs to rely on authority of others, but instead has learned to verify his own beliefs. Further, the more educated he becomes, the more he frees himself from dependence on the word of others. In particular, this modern attitude is symbolized by the spirit of a college professor who asked his students concerning a miracle, "Do you believe that just because it is in the Bible?" Deeper investigation reveals that all of these attitudes just mentioned are rotten to the core. A fellow by the name of Philip Wheelwright, in his book, The Way of Philosophy, that came out in 1960, points out, no one can verify for himself everything which he finds is useful to know. He appeals, therefore, to the testimony of men and of books which he supposes to possess a high degree of competence in their fields, end of quote. Those who believe that we can now function without the reliance of authorities are gullible. The choice is not between dependence on facts and on the dependence of authority, because authority is one of the chief ways in which facts are to be ascertained. Facts are known only through the report of people, whether it be others or ourselves. The French historian de Tocqueville, nearly 2 centuries ago, pointed out the impossibility a man would face who had to prove firsthand all the truth he accepted. He writes, "There is no philosopher of so great parts in the world, but that he believes a million of things on the faith of other people, and supposes a great many more truths than he demonstrates." The idea that one's independence of others grows with education is not only incorrect, but it is the opposite of what really happens. The more one reads, the more he learns from the travels, the experiments, the research, and the usable theories of others. Now, this does not mean that any report of witnesses should be accepted uncritically. Much that we have heard is based on rumor or prejudice. We do make mistakes in putting trust in false authorities, but it is not doubtful that we make any more mistakes here than in any other type of knowledge. The important fact is that the more we trust authorities, the more certain we can become. Again, Wheelwright points out, to accept any person, book, institution, or supernatural revelation as authoritative means that we believe him or it to have good grounds of making statements in a certain sphere which we ourselves lack, end of quote. Reliance on authority is much more decisive with some arguments than with others. For example, a claim that a certain painting is more praiseworthy than another painting may be unprovable. Yet the claim that General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown can be established with absolute certainty, even though we did not observe it directly. The evidence provided by past numerous witnesses makes the claim, or the case for the claim, as conclusive as any event which we have observed directly today. It is, in fact, events of history which must be established by authority, even though not all historical reports can be verified. For example, the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree did not meet the test of evidence, where other facts about the life of Washington did. We confidently believe that he was America's first president. In fact, if a historian could prove that Washington was not the father of our country, then that would be a bigger shock than to learn that 2 + 2 = 5. Evidence is overwhelming, although it is impossible to find any current eyewitnesses. Some reasons for his certainty as being president is, number one, the number of witnesses. Number two, the lack of any conflicting evidence. Number three, the lack of any conceivable motive for even one witness to lie. In short, it would be far easier to believe the cherry tree story than to believe that friends made up and pulled off the story of Washington as the first president. Although reason itself may confirm the plausibility of the Christian faith, the Christian does believe certain things because they are in the Bible. This does not mean that he believes them just because they are in print. It is important to realize that in the matter of such a thing as faith, several types of evidence may be at issue, although many unbelievers think it is based upon blind acceptance of unproven authority. It is important to consider that certain key events in the Bible are subject to proof or disproof. Knowledge of biblical events can be evaluated in the same way as other historical events. The event as the resurrection of Jesus being reported by many witnesses. Further, the belief in the resurrection led to visible consequences, results which called for an explanation. If we can examine a miracle, such as the resurrection, and to find that it stands the test of relevant historical questions, we will again find confirmation of the fact that the solid reason points in the direction of faith. In regard to any biblical or secular historical fact, certain basic questions are in order. Number one, how reliable does the documentation appear to be? Number two, how many witnesses were there to the event? Number three, what was the reaction of those who heard the report? Number four, what was the character of the witnesses? Number five, did the witnesses have anything to gain by lying? And number six, how deep was the conviction of the witnesses. While all of these questions are relevant, our attention this morning is going to be focused on the first question, while the remaining tests will be applied to the report of the early witnesses concerning how Christianity began. So again, our question is, how reliable does the documentation appear to be? The first question, of course, presupposes other questions such as, how old are the oldest texts? How many ancient texts are available? Number 3, how soon were the records written after the reported events? And number 4, were the writers either first-hand witnesses or close acquaintance of those who were? Now, critics who reject the miraculous claims of the New Testament generally apply more rigid tests to the New Testament documents than they do to these historical works. For example, if an ancient work contradicts the New Testament, critics seldom inquire into the reliability of the manuscripts for that secular work. They just accept it as being right and the Bible as being wrong. In reality, the textual evidence for the New Testament documents reliability is far superior to all other books from antiquity. John A.T. Robinson points this out in his book, Can We Trust the New Testament? He talks about the wealth of manuscripts and the narrow interval of time between the writing and the earliest present copies that he makes it the best attested text of all or any ancient writing. Robinson continues, he says, in the case of the New Testament, there are, as I said, literally hundreds of witnesses, and in no case is there an interval more than 300 years, and in many parts now a good deal less. In fact, one papyrus fragment of St. John's Gospel stands so close to the time of writing as actually to have ruled out some of the later and in some cases wilder dates proposed for its composition, end of quote. The oldest complete manuscripts to date come around 250 years after the likely time of writing. There are numerous references to the original sources beginning as early as AD 90 with the writing of Clement. The basic doctrines of Christianity are all found in the early church fathers within 100 years after the time they were originally taught. Sir Frederick Kenyon was one of the top experts of the last century concerning the history of biblical texts. In summary of the status of textual studies, he wrote, for all the works of classical antiquity, we have to depend on manuscripts written long after their original composition. The author who is best in case in this respect is Virgil. Yet the earliest manuscript of Virgil that we now possess was written some 350 years after his death. For all other classical writers, the interval between the date of the author and the earliest existing manuscript of his work is even greater. For Livy, about 500 years. Horace, 900 years. For most of Plato, 1,300 years. And for Epictetus, 1,600 years. Kenyon goes on to say, the great volume unicos of the New Testament were written perhaps some 250 years after the date when the Gospels were actually composed, while we now have papyrus manuscripts which reduce the interval of 100 years, and while the manuscripts of any classical author among at most to a few score, and in some cases only to a few units. The manuscripts of the Bible are reckoned by thousands. their very quantity adds to the difficulties of an editor, since the more manuscripts, the greater number of various readings. But they make the authenticity of the works themselves overwhelmingly certain, end of quote. But there is further evidence which pushes the date of the original Greek text to even an earlier time. The translation of the Greek text into other languages began even earlier. According to Kenyon, the New Testament had been translated into Syria, Latin, and Coptic before the end of the 3rd century. The first two go back into the 2nd century. Kenyon writes, the original translators must have used Greek manuscripts then existing. We have the evidence of Greek manuscripts earlier than any which have come down to us. The solid evidence we from the 2nd century almost assure the originals go back to the 1st century. Now, the most significant discovery of the 20th century is a collection known as the Chester Beatty Papyrus. It was discovered in 1930. It includes fragments of the Old Testament. But what's more important is a collection of the New Testaments, which is very important. Kenyon describes one finding as follows. One was originally a copy of the 4 Gospels and Acts, written in small hand, which the paleographers agree in assigning to the first half of the 3rd century, that is to say, a century older than the Vaticanicus and the Scientificus. A second set gives a nearly complete collection of the epistles of Paul. The effect of this find is that we now have the majority of Paul's writings in a copy written about a century and a half after his death. Our manuscripts evidence is far more adequate for demonstrating that we have the same text as the original that was written. Our next question, what is the time lapse between the written text and the events described? Now, there's overwhelming evidence that they're written prior to the end of the 1st century, though scholarship does not agree exactly on the dates written for most New Testament books. For example, Paul's Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon is believed between 60 and 63. They're not sure which of those of that. Or Paul's 1st and 2nd epistles were between 63 and 67. However, all scholars do agree that between AD 50 to just before AD 70 was for all the New Testament writings except that of the Apostle John's, which were recorded in the 90s. Now, in 1935, a fellow by the name of Sidney Roberts published a fragment of the John chapter 18, which was found in a John Rylands library. This fragment is judged by the scholars to date from AD 50 or earlier. What this means is that we have parts of an actual text of the gospel records, which are dated between AD 100 and AD 50. Without question, it is a copy of yet an earlier text. So the significance is that the text can be dated as far back as the time of those who were students of the eyewitnesses, or we would refer to as a 2nd generation Christians. Well, let's talk for a moment about these writers as eyewitnesses. None of this next generation ever questioned that the gospel records came from eyewitnesses. On the contrary, written records from this time confirm the fact that these who knew the establishment of Christianity from the earlier disciples believed that the 4 Gospels to be accurate reports of what actually happened. Brethren, today, when a critic asks for proof, we can say that without question, the gospel records as we have them were in circulation during the lives of some of the eyewitnesses and all of the New Testament records were available to the disciples who had learned from the apostles. These people who were in a position to know were either responsible for the writing or they allowed the records to pass as confirmed truth. Consequently, they either believed completely that the records were claimed as they were, or they conscientiously endorsed lies. If the events which are described did not occur, the eyewitnesses were either deceived themselves or they deceived others, which we understand from history was not so. We can know for certain Christianity is completely true, no matter from which direction you approach it. It is an invalid belief to accept that Christianity is based on documents which are not the original writings, therefore they are unreliable. Or the other false view is that we cannot accept them because there was this big gap between the time of writing and the actual events which the Bible or biblical writers described. In regard to the first charge, the New Testament is based on far better manuscript evidence than any other ancient writing. And perhaps God had good reason not to give the original manuscripts that the apostles wrote. After all, if we had the originals in our possession, superstitious folks would turn them into idols and build huge shrines around them, making pilgrimages to worship such idols or objects in foolish ignorance. Or in regard to the second charge, archaeology is constantly narrowing the gap between the periods of writing and the event. The gap is now so narrow it means that if the records are not correct, eyewitnesses of the events apparently allowed the gospel to circulate filled with deception. Now, in our morning scripture reading, it came from Acts chapter 17. Paul was in Athens attempting to convince the Jewish philosophers and the religious Athenians about the God of creation as also the God of mankind through his Son Jesus Christ, which he furnished proof by raising him from the dead. Now the reaction is recorded in the very next verse, verse 32. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. This morning, you can be like these ancients. You can consider Christianity as a mere myth or just delay. There's the other word, I'm just wrong blank right now, guys. I have a jet lag. Well, in neither case, though, will this bring you closer to God. However, there is another response, and it's mentioned in verse 34. But some men joined him and believed. So this morning, what will your answer be? Will it be to reject, to delay, or to obey? If it's obey, then you need to do that through belief, repentance, and water immersion for the forgiveness of your sins. And then embrace New Testament Christianity, which is a proven fact of history. You cannot refute it. You can deny it, you can do whatever, but it's here and it will be until the end of time. So if you want to become part of the family of God, then come forward and be immersed in water for the washing of your sins. As together we stand and as we